The air at the frozen lake tasted of sharpened ice and the vast, indifferent silence of winter. My boots crunched a rhythm against the packed snow, each step a precise measure against the stark, white expanse. I often sought this place before the day's true work began. A pilgrimage to the edge of the world, where the only sound was the wind's whisper across the unyielding surface. A voice that carried no meaning, only the chill of empty space. Here, amidst the skeletal trees and the sky the color of bruised plums, my thoughts, usually a tangled skein of forgotten doctrines and obscure symbols, found a rare crystalline order. I was Marcus Chen, and my life was a carefully constructed edifice of research, solitude, and the systematic dissection of the world's most peculiar fictions. I preferred the company of ancient texts to living breath, the silent arguments of forgotten scholars more compelling than any contemporary discourse. My field, fringe mythologies, was itself a quiet, isolated corner of academia, a perfect reflection of my own existence. This morning, however, a peculiar tremor ran beneath the surface of my usual calm. It wasn't the lake, which remained a polished mirror of impenetrable ice. It was an anticipation, a faint, almost imperceptible hum that had been growing in the periphery of my awareness for days. I was due at the city's central archives, not for some grand, groundbreaking revelation, but for a mundane cross-referencing task. A series of marginalia in an early 19th century collection of local folklore had piqued my interest. The notes, scrawled in a hand both elegant and unhinged, hinted at geometries that defied the very paper they were etched upon. A curious anomaly, nothing more, yet it tugged at a thread of my meticulously ordered reality. Rows upon rows of climate-controlled steel shelves, each holding centuries of human endeavor, or folly, depending on one's perspective. The air, dry and cool, carried the faint, sweet scent of aging paper and dust motes dancing in the shafts of anemic light that filtered through high, grimy windows. The archivist, a woman whose spectacles seemed to magnify her already severe expression, greeted me with a nod that was more a dismissal than an acknowledgement. She pointed me toward Section Gamma, Shelf 17, and then retreated behind her fortified desk, a sentinel guarding the silent knowledge. I moved through the labyrinthine corridors, the hushed reverence of the place almost palpable. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate rustle of ancient vellum, traced the spines of countless forgotten volumes. The specific collection I sought was nestled between a treatise on medieval alchemy and a surprisingly dull compendium of regional agricultural practices. It was a slim, unassuming volume, bound in faded leather, its title barely legible. I pulled it free, a puff of fine, gray dust escaping its pages like a sigh. My fingers brushed against one such drawing, a series of nested, non-concentric spirals that seemed to twist into themselves, receding into an impossible depth. A prickle of unease, sharp and sudden, traced a path up my arm. It was something else. I settled at a vacant table, the single overhead lamp casting a harsh, unforgiving circle of light on the aged wood. The notes were not merely commentary. They were a desperate attempt to describe something indescribable. The author, a forgotten local cleric, spoke of angles beyond perception, of forms that devour the eye. He mentioned a keystone, an anchor of the impossible. My breath hitched. It was a crude yet ingenious hiding place. My fingers, trembling slightly despite my will, unlatched the tiny brass clasp. Inside, nestled on faded crimson, lay the artifact. Its geometry was an affront to reason. There were no straight lines, no recognizable curves, yet it possessed a terrifying symmetry. Each surface met another at an angle that defied Euclidean space, creating a form that seemed to fold in on itself, constantly shifting, though it remained perfectly still. My eyes struggled to resolve its shape, my mind rebelling against the information it received. It was a thing of impossible dimensions, a solid object that seemed to occupy no space, or perhaps all space at once. A low thrum began within my skull, a vibration not of sound, but of pure pressure, pushing against the delicate membranes of my inner ear. The air in the archive, once still, now felt thick, heavy, charged with an invisible current. My rationality, my meticulously constructed defense against the chaotic, the unprovable, began to fray at the edges. This was not a mere curiosity. This was a direct assault on the fundamental principles I held sacred. As my fingertip brushed against one of its facets, a jolt, not electrical, but profoundly mental, shot through me. It was a sudden, overwhelming influx of nothing. My vision blurred. The orderly shelves of the archive seemed to ripple, the very air around me distorting. For a fleeting, horrifying moment, I wasn't in the archive at all. I snatched my hand back, my heart hammering a frantic, discordant rhythm against my ribs. My breath caught in my throat, a ragged gasp. The thrum in my head intensified, a relentless, insistent presence. My academic curiosity, once a shield, now felt like a gaping wound, inviting something in. This was not a myth to be catalogued, but a reality to be endured. And I, Marcus Chen, the meticulous historian, felt an unshakable compulsion to understand the impossible thing I now held, even if it meant dismantling every truth I had ever known. The lid lifted with a soft, almost inaudible sigh, revealing not parchment or aged jewel, but an object of profound, unsettling silence. It was no larger than my palm, wrought from a material that absorbed light rather than reflected it, a hue deeper than any shadow I had ever witnessed. Its form defied logic. It was a solid paradox, a three-dimensional impossibility that mocked the very laws of physics I understood. I lifted it, the weight surprisingly negligible, yet it felt dense with a kind of contained nullity. My thumb brushed a surface that was both smooth and subtly abrasive, like polished obsidian that had been eroded by an unseen current. It was a resonance, a quiet hum that settled behind my eyes, dulling the edges of my peripheral vision. Books on ancient civilizations, forgotten cults, and esoteric symbols lay open around it, their pages now seeming like quaint nursery rhymes in the face of this impossible geometry. I spent hours, then days, examining it under various lights, through magnifying lenses, even with the crude spectral analysis tools I owned. No known element, no discernible structure, no logical origin. It was a tear in the fabric of the rational world, made manifest. The first subtle disturbances were easy to dismiss. I attributed them to fatigue, the strain of late nights poring over ancient texts, or the sheer intellectual vertigo induced by the artifact. My routine, once a comforting rhythm of research and contemplation, began to fray. Meals were forgotten. Sleep became a fractured landscape of strange, formless dreams. One afternoon, as I meticulously sketched the object's impossible curves, a peculiar shift occurred. The books on my shelves, usually a comforting backdrop of knowledge, suddenly seemed to loom, their titles blurring into indecipherable glyphs. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles white, waiting for the sensation to pass. It did, leaving behind only a faint ringing in my ears and the persistent low thrum from the artifact, which now seemed to vibrate with a more insistent energy. "Overwork, Marcus," I murmured to myself, my voice raspy. "Just overwork." But the gnawing began. The artifact was more than a mere curiosity. It was a challenge, a defiance. Every attempt to apply logic crumbled against its impossible form. It existed, yet it could not exist. This paradox became a constant, irritating itch beneath my skin, an intellectual discord that resonated with the subtle psychic hum. Days bled into a singular, elongated stretch of time. I neglected calls from a colleague, ignoring the insistent chirping of my phone. The outside world, once a distant hum, now felt impossibly remote, an echo from a life I was quickly shedding. The only reality was the artifact, its silent, impossible presence dominating my thoughts, my perceptions. One bitter morning, needing air, needing distance, I found myself walking towards the frozen lake, the biting wind a welcome assault against my flushed face. The ice, a vast white expanse under a bruised sky, stretched out, silent and unforgiving. Here, under the indifferent vault of the heavens, I hoped to find clarity. I walked to the center, the crunch of my boots on the compacted snow the only sound for miles. Yet, even here, the artifact's influence seemed to ripple. It was not just the absence of sound, but an active, consuming quiet, as if the very world held its breath. My stomach churned, a primal fear seizing me. When I opened them again, the world had settled. The sky was merely gray, the ice undeniably solid. But the feeling lingered, a residue of profound unease. It was as if the artifact had reached out, even across the distance, to touch the world around me, twisting it to its own, impossible logic. The impossible geometry of it defied all reason, a silent scream against the ordered universe. It extended, yes, but into what dimension? What impossible reach I could not fathom? My hands, once precise and steady, now trembled faintly as I traced the cold, alien lines. Sleep had become a stranger, replaced by a restless current of obsession. My study, a sanctuary of leather-bound volumes and digital archives, transformed into a war room. Books lay open like dissected organs, their pages brittle with age, their ink faded to ghost whispers. My screens glowed with the pale luminescence of ancient texts, obscure manuscripts and fragmented digital records, each a tiny thread in a labyrinth I was determined to chart. Days bled into nights. My gaze, once sharp, blurred at the edges, yet my focus on the task remained unnervingly keen. I devoured accounts of strange stones falling from forgotten skies, of impossible structures glimpsed in fleeting, feverish dreams, of geometric anomalies that drove ancient scholars to despair. Then, a flicker, a shift in the air, subtle as a breath, yet profound. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, my breath catching. The air grew strangely heavy, a weight pressing against my skin, raising the fine hairs on my arms. Nothing. Only the familiar, comforting clutter of my academic life. I felt watched, profoundly and intimately, as if the very act of my searching was being observed, known, understood by something vast and profoundly indifferent. A forgotten scroll, digitized by a reclusive collector, yielded its secrets in a rush of archaic script. This was it. A direct, albeit ancient and veiled, reference. The feeling of being observed intensified, an internal hum now matching the artifact's subtle thrum. It was a knowing, not a seeing. A vast, patient awareness that permeated the walls, the very air I breathed. I felt a sudden, desperate urge to escape, to breathe air that wasn't laden with this silent scrutiny. My destination, though unplanned, pulled me with an inexplicable magnetism. The frozen lake. The vast expanse of ice gleamed under the sliver of a crescent moon, a mirror to the indifferent sky. The silence was not empty. It was pregnant, brimming with unspoken things. I looked down at the ice, its surface a mosaic of trapped bubbles and hairline fractures. Below, the dark water lay still, impenetrable. And then, a shift in the reflection. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only my own bewildered gaze. My heart seized. It wasn't just the texts. It wasn't just the feeling. It was everywhere. The artifact was not merely an object. It was a lens. And through it, the world itself was beginning to fracture, to reveal its true, terrifying face. I was a tiny point on a vast frozen lake, and something ancient and unknowable had finally noticed me. It was not loud, yet it swallowed all other sound, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. My hands, still tracing the impossibly angled lines, felt alien to me, as if they belonged to a stranger, guided by an impulse I did not recognize. A chill, unlike any cold I had known, seeped not from the artifact, but from within my own chest, spreading outward, a cold that seemed to hollow me. The familiar plaster seams, once a comforting grid, twisted into configurations that defied simple Euclidean geometry. They were fleeting, these visual distortions, like phantoms caught in peripheral vision, dissolving the moment I tried to fix them with a direct gaze. Yet their impression lingered, a persistent afterimage on the retina of my mind, a phantom itch behind my eyes. The world, once a dependable framework of right angles and predictable curves, now seemed to possess a hidden, fluid logic, always just beyond the grasp of my conscious thought. I would blink, and for a fraction of a second, the very air around me would shimmer with these impossible tessellations, a brief glimpse into a dimension not meant for my eyes. A leather-bound tome I had left on my desk, its spine facing the wall, would be found hours later splayed open on the floor, its fragile pages riffling as if by an invisible breeze. The scent of old paper and dust, a comfort to me, was subtly overlaid with something else. A metallic tang, like ozone after a storm, or perhaps something far older, something mineral and deep, like rock scraped bare from the earth's core. A ceramic teacup, always placed on the left side of the sink, would appear on the right. It was not a grand, overt haunting, but a relentless, microscopic erosion of order, designed to undermine the very foundation of my rational mind. The most unsettling shifts were those of time. A morning could stretch into an eternity, each second distended and thick with an unseen pressure, only for the entire day to collapse into a single blurred memory, leaving me with the disorienting conviction that hours had simply vanished. I would begin a task, absorbed in the careful process of research, my mind a sharp instrument dissecting ancient texts, only to look up and find the ambient light had drastically changed, the clock on the wall showing a jump of several hours. My initial thought was exhaustion, a scholar's fatigue, but the sensation was too sharp, too deliberate. It felt like reality itself was skipping frames, a film reel with missing segments, and I was the only one noticing the abrupt cuts. The world around me felt increasingly like a poorly edited film, full of continuity errors that only I perceived, a private madness unfolding in plain sight. One afternoon, driven by a nameless restlessness, or perhaps a subconscious yearning for the stark, immutable clarity of the natural world, I walked to the frozen lake. The air was a biting sculptor, carving the bare branches of the trees into skeletal lace against a bruised sky. I sought solace in its expanse, in the clean lines of the distant shore, hoping to anchor my fraying perceptions against something solid and true. But even here, the influence followed, unbidden and insidious. Impossible tessellations, structures that should not exist in two dimensions, pulsed into being, only to recede like a breath on a cold window. That night, sleep offered no refuge. I saw my apartment walls breathing, the wallpaper peeling back to reveal not plaster, but a shifting, organic membrane pulsating with the same impossible geometry I had glimpsed on the lake and in the corners of my vision. The hum that had taken root in my marrow now sang a constant low chord, a melody only I could discern. It was not a sound, but a presence. A subtle distortion in the fabric of quietude that made every other noise seem thin. False. My hands, still tingling from their impossible caress of the artifact, felt less like my own and more like delicate instruments, attuned to a frequency no human should perceive. This intimate connection, this silent communion, began to eclipse the mundane world with its insistent, shimmering veil. Conversations with the few colleagues I still encountered became exercises in strained civility. A librarian, her spectacles perched on her nose, inquired about a misplaced folio, her voice a distant, reedy whisper. I stared at her, not truly seeing her, but seeing through her, as if the air around her shimmered with the same faint, impossible geometry that defined the artifact. My gaze, I knew, was too intense, too unblinking. The folio, I finally managed. My own voice a rusty hinge. It's not lost, it's merely reconfigured. She blinked, a slow, deliberate movement, then her lips thinned. "Marcus, are you quite well?" she asked, a thread of concern woven into the polite question. But I heard accusation, a subtle probing. She knew. Or worse, it knew through her. I simply walked away, the hum in my bones momentarily sharpening into a high-pitched whine. The shift in others was imperceptible to anyone but me. A quick, averted glance from a passing researcher in the corridor became a signal. The hushed tones of two archivists discussing their weekend plans twisted into conspiratorial whispers about me, about it. I drew the heavy velvet curtains, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight, the better to observe the subtle shifts in the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light that dared to pierce the gloom. I started to scrutinize the bindings of my oldest books, convinced that the arcane symbols stamped into the leather were not merely decorative, but coded messages, warnings, or perhaps invitations. The artifact sat on my desk, a silent obsidian god. I spent hours simply observing it, tracing its impossible angles with my eyes, convinced that if I stared long enough, the true nature of its influence would coalesce before me. It wasn't merely resonant, it was communicating. Not with words, but with a deeper, more fundamental language that reshaped my very perception of reality. And what did others know? One frigid afternoon, a desperate need for absolute stillness, for a landscape as blank and indifferent as my own fraying mind, compelled me outward. I found myself at the edge of a frozen lake, its surface a vast, unblemished mirror reflecting the bruised, starless sky. The expanse stretched before me, a canvas of gray and white, utterly devoid of life, utterly indifferent to my presence. Here, I thought, here, it cannot follow. They were not merely confused by my erratic behavior. They were aware. Not of the artifact itself, perhaps, not of the specific angles and impossible curves, but of the space it created. The hum, the subtle distortion, the peeling back of the veil. They sensed it too, but in a different way. They weren't agents of it, not in the way I'd first feared. They were merely vessels. The world was not merely distorted for me. It was permeated. They were not actively hiding knowledge. They were unconsciously reacting to a reality that was slowly, inexorably shifting beneath their feet. I was not alone in experiencing it, but utterly, terrifyingly alone in understanding what it truly was. The isolation I had sought was merely a reflection of the cosmic truth. We were all adrift on a frozen lake, and the ice was beginning to thin. Sleep had become a luxurious myth, a soft blanket I could no longer grasp. I moved through my days in a haze, the glow of my desk lamp a solitary sun in a universe of ink and parchment. The artifact sat on its velvet cushion, a silent, angular god demanding my devotion. Its non-Euclidean angles seemed to ripple at the edges of my vision, not moving but implying motion, a geometry that defied all understanding. I had exhausted the mainstream, the fringe, the esoteric. Now I plunged into the truly forbidden. Texts whispered about in hushed tones, volumes deemed too dangerous for open shelves, salvaged from forgotten archives or private collections whose owners had met unfortunate ends. My fingers, stained with ancient dust, skimmed over brittle pages detailing a forgotten age, a time before the known world. I cross-referenced fragmented accounts of impossible architecture, cyclical cataclysms, and the slow, insidious erosion of what humanity considered real. A pattern began to emerge, a terrifying tapestry woven from disparate threads. The entity wasn't a god, not in any sense I understood. Gods demanded worship, offered salvation or damnation. This was something else. A fundamental principle of distortion, an indifferent architect of entropy. Its influence wasn't malevolent, but rather the consequence of its very being, like a mountain shadow falling across a village, crushing it without malice. The air in my study grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. My reflection in the window pane was a gaunt stranger, eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on something beyond the glass. I needed air, needed the vast, indifferent expanse of the world to remind me of its solidity. I drove, the city lights blurring into streaking tiers of color, until I reached the edge of the wilderness, a place where the trees stood skeletal against a bruised sky. The biting wind clawed at my exposed skin, but I welcomed the sensation, a grounding force against the swirling chaos in my mind. The lake stretched out, a sheet of frosted glass, silent and immense. But the hum followed. A low, resonant thrum vibrated through the frozen water, a sound too deep, too vast, to be merely the expansion and contraction of ice. For a fleeting instant, the face staring back wasn't mine. Then, through the ice, far below, I saw something. Not a fish, not a shadow from the surface. It was the hum made visible, a silent, indifferent presence beneath the world's thin skin. Back in my study, huddled over a particularly obscure manuscript, a collection of symbols and glyphs from a forgotten culture that predated any known civilization, the final, horrifying pieces clicked into place. The text spoke of the great stillness, not an absence, but a presence so absolute it subsumed all other existence. It was not malevolent in the human sense of wishing harm, but simply existed, and in its existence, it imposed its own alien reality. The glyphs, when viewed through the lens of the artifact's impossible geometry, revealed a terrifying intent. Not to destroy, but to overwrite. To make its truth the only truth. To peel back the layers of our consensual reality and replace them with its own, utterly indifferent cosmic design. I dropped the manuscript, the brittle pages scattering across the floor like dead leaves. The world outside my window, the familiar cityscape, the distant rumble of traffic, all seemed thin, translucent. I saw through it, or rather, I saw what was trying to push through it. There was no going back. Sleep offered no reprieve. The hum became the rhythm of my dreams, twisting familiar faces into grotesque, silent screams. I craved an antidote, a stark, unyielding silence to recalibrate my frayed senses. My escape led me to the vast, desolate expanse of a frozen lake. The biting air was a welcome shock, a tangible pressure against my face that promised to scour away the phantom vibrations. Beneath a sky the color of bruised plums, the ice stretched, an enormous polished mirror reflecting the somber clouds. I walked onto its glassy surface, each careful step a crunching whisper in the immense quiet. The cold seeped through my boots, a clean, sharp ache that was, for a moment, precisely what I needed. Here, I thought, no echoes of impossible geometry could intrude. Here, only the wind, the brittle ice, and the vast empty space. But the silence was a fragile thing, easily shattered. Then, the colors began to warp. The bruised plum sky rippled, bleeding into impossible shades of chartreuse and a deep, pulsing indigo that had no place in any known spectrum. The ice itself, previously a muted gray-white, shimmered with veins of internal light, a network of emerald and obsidian glowing from within its depths, shifting with a slow, deliberate pulse. My eyes ached, struggling to reconcile these phantoms with the familiar world. I squeezed my eyelids shut, pressing the heels of my hands into them, trying to banish the aberrant hues. A low, guttural murmur began to weave itself into the hum, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It spoke no words, conveyed no message, but its sheer presence was a violation, a sound that should not exist, a vibration that threatened to dislodge my very teeth. My breath hitched. It was no longer merely the absence of warmth. It was a presence, a vast, formless entity pressing in on me from all sides. The air grew heavy, thick with an invisible weight that pushed against my chest, making each breath a struggle. It was as if the very space around me had solidified, becoming a gelid, living membrane. The surface of the frozen lake, once solid and dependable, began to feel pliable, subtly shifting beneath my weight. I could feel a vast, slow heartbeat beneath the ice, a rhythmic throb that pulsed through my soles, up my legs, and into the core of my being. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks. This was an assault, a deliberate unraveling of my most fundamental perceptions. I saw a ripple, not on the ice, but through the air itself. A distortion that suggested something immense was moving, though my eyes registered no form. I tried to plant my feet firmly to assert my physical presence against the encroaching chaos, but the ground felt like yielding flesh. The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. The entity wasn't just influencing my mind, it was these sensations. It had no form in the way I understood it, no shape to be perceived, but its presence manifested as this sensory overload, this direct, unbearable assault on my reality. It was the impossible colors, the non-existent sounds, the tactile pressure of something vast and formless pressing in on me. I was not merely witnessing its effects. I was directly experiencing its indifferent, overwhelming existence through the complete dissolution of my own senses. The world had become its canvas, and I, Marcus Chen, was merely a brushstroke, being painted out of existence. I could no longer trust my own perceptions. Every sight, every sound, every touch was a lie, a monstrous illusion crafted by a presence that dwarfed all comprehension. My hands, still tingling from their impossible caress of the artifact, felt cold, yet strangely alive. A pull, insistent and undeniable, had taken root, not in my logic, but in something deeper, a primal current that bypassed reason. I knew where I had to go. The drive was a blur of frosted landscapes and an internal monologue that was no longer entirely my own. The steering wheel felt foreign in my grip, the familiar dashboard lights shimmering with an unholy luminescence. Each mile marker seemed to dissolve into the next, drawn into the vortex of the hum. My determination wasn't a choice, not truly. It was a consequence, a reaction to the artifact's silent, ceaseless command. The air outside grew sharper, biting, a promise of desolation. I left the vehicle on a snow-drifted track, the engine's dying cough swallowed by the immense silence. Before me stretched the vast, desolate expanse of the frozen lake. The sky, a bruised purple, bled into the horizon, mirroring the ice that lay like a shattered mirror underfoot. It throbbed now, a dull ache that resonated with the frozen landscape, with the emptiness. I walked out onto the ice, each step a testament to a resolve that felt less like courage and more like an inevitable descent. The surface groaned beneath me, a deep, resonant complaint from the ancient water trapped below. I stood at the center of that vast white plain, a solitary speck against an indifferent backdrop. My focus was inward, on the crescendo of the hum. It was no longer a sound. It was a pressure, a crushing weight behind my eyes, a vibration that threatened to unravel the very threads of my being. Then it began, not as a voice, not as words, but as a flood. A torrent of impossible information, a deluge of pure, unadulterated concept poured into my mind. It was a sensation of colors I had no names for, shapes that defied geometry, a cacophony of non-sounds that peeled back the skin of reality. I saw, or rather perceived, vast, indifferent architectures of existence, structures that dwarfed galaxies, built from something other than matter, something more fundamental and terrifying. These were not images, they were truths, raw and unfiltered, slammed directly into the core of my consciousness. My mind reeled, grasping for purchase, for a familiar anchor in the storm. I was nothing. Humanity was nothing. Our triumphs, our loves, our fleeting fears, all utterly inconsequential. The entity was not malicious in the way a human understood malice. It simply was. Its presence was a vast, cold shadow cast across eternity, and I had, through my foolish curiosity, stepped into its penumbra. The understanding was not a sudden flash of insight, but a slow, excruciating erosion. My psychological defenses, painstakingly constructed over a lifetime, crumbled like sandcastles against an unimaginable tide. The self, the I that was Marcus Chen, felt stretched thin, translucent, about to snap, and I had torn the scrim. My breath hitched, a ragged, desperate sound in the immense quiet. I had sought knowledge, and in its terrible acquisition, I had shed sanity. But it wasn't truly empty. It was filled with the terrifying clarity of understanding. I understood now. I understood the artifact, the hum, the pull. The entity had spoken, not with a voice, but with the very fabric of existence, and its message was simple. You are nothing, and there is only me. The hum, once a whisper, had now swollen into a resonant thrum that vibrated the very bones of my skull. It was a compass, a terrible, undeniable north that drew me from the familiar, crumbling edges of my sanity towards an understanding I both craved and dreaded. My hands, still bearing the phantom tingle of the artifact's impossible geometry, gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the worn leather. The road unwound before me, a ribbon of asphalt leading into a landscape that grew increasingly desolate. The trees thinning to skeletal sentinels against a sky the color of bruised plums. The ancient lore, once a mere academic pursuit, now sang with a horrifying clarity, pointing towards a place where the veil between what was and what should not be was thinnest. It was not a choice, but a surrender. A final, irrevocable step into the maw that had slowly been consuming my world. My breath plumed in front of me, obscuring the view for a fleeting moment, a ghost of the life I was leaving behind. The world outside the car windows began to distort. Telephone poles leaned at impossible angles, their wires sagging into parabolas that defied gravity. Distant hills shimmered, their peaks dissolving and reforming like smoke. My eyes, though wide and unblinking, struggled to reconcile the shifting panorama with any known reality. This was not a physical deformation of the landscape, I knew, but a twisting of the lens through which I perceived it, a preliminary softening of the world's hard edges by the entity's encroaching presence. Finally, the trees gave way to a vast, barren expanse, and then, without warning, it stretched before me. The frozen lake. It lay like a vast, shattered mirror under the leaden sky, an endless sheet of ice that seemed to absorb all light and sound. The wind, when it came, was not a howl, but a low, sustained sigh, as if the very air was exhaling its last. My car, a mere speck on the edge of this immensity, felt suddenly fragile, an absurd anachronism in a place that seemed to predate time itself. I killed the engine. The sudden silence was not empty, but filled with the amplified hum that now pulsed in every nerve ending. My boots crunched on the frozen earth, each sound amplified, then swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the lake. The ice of the lake was not uniformly white or gray. It held impossible hues, veins of deep indigo and sickly green swirling beneath the surface, catching the meager light in ways that defied optics. This was the threshold. I felt it in the prickling of my skin, in the sudden lightness in my head, as if the atmospheric pressure had dropped to an impossible low. I began to walk, each step a deliberate act of will against a growing tide of unease. The ice beneath my feet was unnervingly smooth, yet my steps produced no sound, no reassuring crunch. It was as if my weight was absorbed, my presence negated by the sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the place. The horizon, once a distant line, now seemed to curve in on itself, drawing me towards an unseen center. The sky, a moment ago a uniform gray, now swirled with faint iridescent currents like oil on water, reflecting nothing known. As I ventured further, the very air seemed to thicken, to become a tangible presence. My vision, usually so precise, began to waver. The distant shore, which I had carefully marked with a solitary stunted pine, would suddenly leap forward, then recede, mocking my sense of distance. They were not solid, not truly there, but impressions, echoes of a reality that bled into my own. And then, I saw it. Not a mirage, not a trick of light, but a definite anomaly, a focal point in the swirling chaos of the ice. As I drew closer, the hum in my skull intensified, becoming a piercing frequency that threatened to shatter my teeth. The ice here was impossibly thin, almost transparent, yet held with an unnatural rigidity. And through it, I saw. It was not a thing, not a creature, but a pattern. An intricate shifting tessellation of lines and angles, coiling inward, endlessly fractal. A diagram of utter meaninglessness that nevertheless held a terrifying cosmic significance. It was the blueprint of unbeing, etched not on a surface, but through the very fabric of existence. This was the reveal. The pattern was not in the ice, it was the ice. It was the lake, it was the maw, and it was waiting. It was not a physical entrance I was looking at, but a perceptual one. A gateway not for my body, but for my very consciousness. The entity was not merely influencing reality. It was this warped reality, and the frozen lake was its most potent manifestation. A horrifying understanding bloomed in my mind. I was not meant to merely observe this, but to become a part of its terrible, indifferent design. The pull was irresistible, a gravitational force on my soul. The air grew sharp, each breath a needlepoint of frigid clarity. The path beneath my worn boots was no longer earth, but a slick, uneven expanse. The wind, a biting phantom, whipped across a vast, desolate plain. Then, through the swirling motes of frozen air, I saw it. The frozen lake. The ice groaned, a deep, mournful sound that seemed to emanate not from the physical surface, but from the very fabric of the desolate landscape. The hum intensified, no longer just a sound, but a pressure, a vibration that threatened to dislodge my teeth, to liquefy the marrow in my bones. It was a language without words, a pure, unfiltered signal that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to the raw, exposed nerve endings of my awareness. The frozen lake was immense, a flat, featureless expanse, and yet, as I ventured further, the very concept of its flatness began to unravel. The horizon, once a clear line, wavered, subtly bending, then folding in on itself, as if the world itself were a sheet of paper being crumpled by an unseen hand. My breath plumed in the glacial air, each exhalation a desperate assertion of my own fleeting warmth. I stopped near the center, or what I perceived to be the center, though the very notion of a fixed point seemed to mock me. The hum had become a roar, not of volume, but of presence. It was a presence that pressed in from all sides, from above and below, from the impossible angles of the warped horizon. The sky, the ice, the distant, indistinguishable tree line, they all seemed to shimmer, to vibrate at a frequency just beyond the grasp of human perception, like an image on a screen struggling to resolve. And then it began. The air above the frozen lake did not simply shimmer. It unwound. It was far more insidious, more profoundly horrifying. It was the absence of form, the negation of structure. This was the reveal, the terrible, unvarnished truth. It was not an entity in the world, but the entity as the world, the underlying principle of its unmaking. It was the indifferent, eternal truth of existence, a cosmic principle that saw no difference between a star and a speck of dust, between the intricate dance of a galaxy and the fleeting thought of a man. I felt its gaze, not as eyes, but as an infinite, unfeeling awareness that simply was. My mind, once a fortress of meticulous knowledge, began to buckle. Memories, the very anchors of my identity, frayed like old ropes in a gale. Marcus Chen, historian, scholar of fringe mythologies. These definitions became meaningless, arbitrary labels in the face of such profound, unblinking indifference. My understanding of geometry, of physics, of the very continuity of cause and effect, dissolved into a meaningless jumble. The ground beneath me was no longer solid, but a shifting, impossible plane. The hum was now the only constant, the only truth, and it was the sound of everything unraveling. A silent scream tore through my throat, a sound lost in the vast, consuming hum. I was nothing. My life, my thoughts, my struggles, they were less than a whisper in an infinite, unhearing void. The entity was not malicious. It simply was. And in its being, it rendered all else inconsequential. My sanity, once a delicate mechanism, was now ground into dust between the cosmic gears of its indifferent presence. My coat, thin against the biting wind, flapped around me like tattered wings, but my steps remained steady, propelled by a will that felt less like my own and more like a current in a vast, unseen ocean. My vision, once clouded by the frantic scramble of human logic, had sharpened to an impossible clarity. The world around me, stripped of its comforting illusions, revealed its stark, skeletal truth. Trees, gnarled and skeletal, clawed at a sky the color of bruised lead. The snow, untrodden and pristine, stretched out like an infinite shroud, leading me to the horizon where the world dissolved into a shimmering expanse. And then I saw it. The frozen lake. It lay vast and silent, a sheet of polished obsidian reflecting the bleak, indifferent heavens. The ice, thick and ancient, groaned softly beneath the pressure of its own immense weight, a sound that resonated with the hum in my skull, a harmony of impending revelation. The wind, no longer merely biting, howled across the expanse, a mournful lament for things lost and things yet to be understood. The artifact, the impossible geometry that had unraveled my world, was not here, not physically. It didn't need to be. Its work was done. It had merely been a key, a tuning fork for a frequency my mind had been too fragile to comprehend. They were not words I could understand, but concepts that flooded my consciousness, pure and undiluted. I felt my sense of self, that tightly wound coil of memories and fears, begin to loosen, unravel. It was not painful, not terrifying, but rather an unburdening, a shedding of skins I had worn for far too long. The ice beneath my feet began to shift, not cracking, but morphing. Patterns emerged from its depths, swirling geometries that defied Euclidean space, mirroring the impossible angles of the artifact. And there, revealed in the shimmering depths, was not water, but an endless churning expanse of nothing. Revealed discovery. This was it. This was the truth that had been whispered to me in fragmented dreams, in the shadows of my study, in the very grain of the world. The entity wasn't a being from another dimension. It was the dimension. It wasn't an invader. It was the fundamental fabric of reality, stretched thin, made visible only through the artifact's terrible influence. The universe was not a grand design, but a fleeting thought within its indifferent, unknowable mind. My life, all human lives, were less than dust motes in the vast, silent expanse of its being. And it was not malevolent, not truly. Malevolence implied intention, and it had none. It simply was. My determined focus, once on finding the truth, shifted. There was nothing left to find, only to become. The hum became a roar, not of sound, but of pure, unadulterated existence. My eyes, wide and unblinking, stared into the impossible geometries beneath the ice, and I saw myself reflected there, not as Marcus Chen, but as a distorted echo, a fleeting ripple on the surface of an infinite ocean. My memories, once a precious tapestry, began to fray at the edges, threads dissolving into the vast, indifferent hum. My childhood home, the scent of old books, the face of a forgotten colleague all became indistinct, meaningless. They were human constructs, frail illusions against the enormity of what lay before me. A profound stillness settled within me, a quiet that swallowed the roar, the wind, the very concept of sound. I was no longer Marcus Chen, the historian, the man who had sought forbidden knowledge. That identity, that carefully constructed prison of self, had dissolved. My breath continued to plume into the frigid air, a mechanical act of a body that still functioned, but the spark, the essence of me, was gone. My hands, once restless with the turning of ancient pages, hung limply at my sides. The entity had not left. It had merely found a new way to manifest, a new conduit. The sun, a pale, anemic disk, began its slow descent, painting the distant snow-capped peaks in shades of bruised purple and gray. The frozen lake stretched out, an infinite mirror to an infinite sky, and I, Marcus Chen, stood upon it, a silent sentinel, a vessel emptied of its humanity, filled instead with the echo of forever. The world continued, oblivious, a stage for its own fleeting dramas, while beneath the ice and within the vacant gaze of a man who was no longer there, the unknowable entity simply was and would always be.